Hello there, and welcome to this video guide to Chapter 2 of Susan Hill's The Woman in Black. So this is the chapter entitled A London Particular. This is probably one of the less easily decipherable chapters because it refers to something that's very specific. It refers to a particular, in this instance, kind of weather experienced in London. You probably could have put that together for yourselves given the title, but it refers directly to the smogs which plagued London for quite a lot of the Industrial Revolution and post-Industrial Revolution era, on into even the sort of 40s, 50s, and 60s until things like the Clean Air Act were passed. So the London particular is a reference to the circumstances that surround Arthur that kind of also give him some impetus to want to get out of London. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. This chapter is the first chapter in the central narrative of the novel. So this is where we move from Arthur telling us that he's going to tell us the story to Arthur actually telling us the story. So here we have a different timeline. And one thing you might want to do is actually try and draw out timelines, have a timeline of the story, but have Arthur's timeline as a character, which is very, very different. And you'll see that because the whole novel is circular, it begins and ends with Arthur, the older character, narrating. So in this chapter, we discover why he's actually travelling to Crith in Gifford and then on to Eel Marsh House, and some of these details are revealed to us. So we find Arthur in a cab. Now, it's not made clear whether this is a motorised cab or whether this is a horse-drawn hansom cab. And again, it's another example, along with a few of the other details in here, which I'll discuss momentarily, of the narrator keeping the timescale vague and flexible so that we can't pin this down to a specific time and place. And this is just part of Hill's kind of stylistic device, where she says this, it makes it very clear that this is a long time ago, a time different from our own, but we can then project onto it whichever time it happens to be most convenient for narrative purposes. Hill herself actually does say that what she is interested in atmosphere, and there are plot holes within her own stories, which she's happy to say is the case, and I think as such, this is entirely true, and the atmosphere and the pacing of the narrative is such that you tend not to notice these things until you really peer at them, and then you realize it's part of this artifice of constructing this imaginary but plausible world. So Arthur sat in the cab and he's reflecting on the kind of the details of the case, or rather the lack of details of the case, and he narrates again in this weirdly constructed past tense narrative. Here he is in the past, remembering a little bit further into the past, and then he tells us this as if it's kind of happening at that point. So it's always, like I say, it's really, really useful to try and get that chronology straight. So Arthur is in a cab. Arthur is remembering being in a cab, remembering being told. But what we learn here is a few key things: the details of the weather in London, in particular. The weather in London is personified. I'll talk about that a bit later as well in a bit more detail. But the weather is vile and unpleasant, and it's described in some fairly strong terms. There's an entire lexical field of hell and damnation used to describe London as it is in this kind of sulphurous smog. We learn about Alice Drablow, and we learn that Mr. Bentley kind of has a sense that not everything was right, although Arthur dismisses it because he often says, Mr. Bentley had this particular phrase that he would describe his clients as a rumman. There was something strange about them, and he tends to say this about more than one of his clients, so Arthur thinks nothing more about it. And we learn here about Eel Marsh House and how it's isolated by the tides. Massive red flags go up for us as a reader, we know we're reading a ghost story. But what we've got to remember is that the Arthur in the story is not the Arthur who is the narrator who's already been through everything. He is the Arthur who hasn't had any idea about what's going to happen to him, doesn't have a clue what's coming, and doesn't believe in anything unusual or out of the ordinary. So he just doesn't spot these details. And don't forget, of course, you have the narrator referring to things and emphasizing things because of the hindsight that they have, because they know now what was important. And this is clear from the fact that throughout this chapter are laced hints of the strangeness of the case. Nothing outright is said, but what we do get, though, instead, is a focus on the atmosphere of London. And essentially, what we have is an environment that drives Arthur away and directly into the path of danger, as we later find out. The chapter finishes with Arthur arriving at King's Cross Station, and King's Cross is briefly described at the start of the next chapter. But again, King's Cross is an interesting set of descriptions. The things to look out for. So, as I said before, the smog in this section of the novel is personified. It's active, it chokes and blinds, smeared and stained. So again, we actually get that listing of the verbs. We also get that parallelism there, the this and that and this and that. So that syntactic parallelism where you get that repetition of the same sentence structure. The listing there, yellow fog, filthy, evil smelling fog. Again, techniques that Hill borrows. Oh, sorry, I think probably better to say that Hill uses in a similar style to Dickens. I wouldn't say she's lifting them directly from Dickens, but she's clearly been influenced by a range of authors who use these techniques as well. Hill very much makes them her own, I feel. It is really interesting that we have this description of London as dangerous, which lulls us and presumably Arthur into the sense that he's escaped something unpleasant and something dangerous on his way to Crith and Gifford, and that when this is obviously the complete opposite of the truth. At the time, though, in industrial London, these fogs were physically dangerous. They were genuinely life-threatening. We even now realize that particulate air pollution is probably responsible for up to, I think I've even seen figures that suggest it's in the UK, it's up to 40,000 excess early deaths due to particulate pollution in mostly densely populated urban areas, the largest of which, of course, is London. These are contributing factors, but the smogs of London in the 1800s and early 1900s were actually physically dangerous for a number of reasons. Number one, they could be so filthy and heavily laden that anyone with any form of respiratory disorder could be killed by them. And they were dangerous for another reason. They literally occluded your sight to the point at which you couldn't see physical dangers on the streets. People would fall down open manhole covers or trip and fall directly into the wide open doors of in those days. So for instance, a public house would have had a door on the street that opened directly to its cellars for barrels of beer to be delivered into, and people would literally just fall down a big hole and hurt themselves, be killed. There were records of people who walked off the edge of paths that led and stopped directly above the Thames. And because they had no idea where they were going, they presumed the path kept on and lost their footing, fell into the Thames and drowned. So there were examples of this being physically dangerous. Again, stepping out into the street in front of a horse and cart or some other form of moving vehicle that you didn't see, and because the sound is muffled and the sound coming from all directions, people got killed and injured in those kinds of circumstances as well. So it is actually a physically dangerous environment. But to Arthur, it's nowhere near as dangerous as the one into which he goes. But Hill here paints a vision of a world that Arthur is glad to escape, and in some respects, the fog drives Arthur out. It is clearly a red herring. We're meant to feel that London is a threatening place, a physically threatening place that Arthur is safer being away from. But of course, this isn't true. And we also see in this chapter a real nod towards the origins of this story and these intertextual references that Hill makes. She's aware of the book's status as fiction. She isn't trying to pretend that this is an historically accurate piece, or indeed that it's anything other than fiction. She plays with the reader here when she actually has Arthur say the business was beginning to sound like something from a Victorian novel. She's referencing the era that has inspired this novel, yet at the same time, she is writing something that is essentially a Victorian novel. And again, we've got this sense of this is another part of the series of techniques that dislocates us in time, because if Arthur's referring to it sounding like it's something from a Victorian novel, presumably he's not in the Victorian period, and yet much of the trappings of what we find seem to be, or could be, late Victorian. So again, it's one of these things that makes it makes you think, okay, when is this set? But it doesn't give you enough material to work on to be able to answer that question. So let's just have a look at a couple of key quotations. So here we've got the first one, the fog was outdoors, and we've got an example of the pathetic fallacy and personification at work. So the negative language, the fact that the fog is active, it's choking and blinding. It's looking to do things, gaining a sly entrance at every opening of a door, like it was actually trying to do something that's actively moving against Arthur. So it is personified as evil, dangerous, and active. And we've also got, as I said before, that parallelism here, another one of the key techniques to look out for. This is a moment that I really think is fantastic. There is a line here that Mr. Bentley delivers. So I'm only picking out 2 quotations from this chapter to kind of look at. There are a few others you can go back into, look for the details of the case, look for the things that are said. But this is one that really stands out to me, that there is a moment, and picture how melodramatic, how almost comical and over the top this would be if this moment were filmed as it was written. As Mr. Bentley, Arthur asks about children, Mr. Bentley goes, children. And then there's a moment of silence as Mr. Bentley thinks and tries to distract himself by trying to rub the window pane clear. And then as he turns, a church bell rings. And then he goes, according to everything we've been told about Mrs. Drablow, no, there were no children. So you have this moment where a question is asked, there's a massive pause, and a church bell rings, this sonorous, tolling noise, and it goes, no, there were no children. A massive, massive red flag that suggests, yeah, children are going to be important. And of course, there is something to do with children later on in the novel. If you've read the novel, you know exactly what we're talking about. But the subtlety of that is kind of embedded in the novel in a way that it doesn't stand out as if, that had been filmed. We get away with this because we move from that moment on to something else. There's just enough emphasis placed on there for us to get a sense something's wrong. But by the time we've thought about it, we've moved on to something else. Arthur's thinking of something else, and we are somewhere else in the narrative. It's only afterwards that we come back to it and go, oh yeah, of course. So there you go. Chapter 2, A London Particular. Thank you very much for listening.